Perfect. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas and Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. This is Comprehensivist Wednesdays, and I am delighted to have Phil back talking about linguistics. And today, it's going to be about Mythologies, a book called Mythologies by Roland Bathe. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Phil. The format is very simple. Phil divides things into, easily digestible bits, takes this whole book and puts little pieces, and then he will present one piece, and then we'll discuss it, and then we'll go to the next one. All right. So with that, Phil.
All right. So last time we took a bit of a detour. We were talking about history. I didn't really plan it like this, but as I was preparing for this meetup, it turned out that a lot of the topics that we covered in our discussion of history really dovetail with what we're going to be talking about today with Roland Barthe. But also, obviously, we're continuing with the broader subject matter of language and linguistics in general. And of course, I think we finished off with a conversation about Ferdinand de Saussure. And just by way of refreshing our memory on that, one of the key contributions of Ferdinand de Saussure was this idea of signs in language, and that language is really a system of signs. And what is a sign? Well, a sign is this combination of a signifier and a signified. Signifier could be a particular word, the way that word sounds, the way that word is written, could be an image, could be a sign language, a sign and sign language. So basically anything that's that's like a code. And the signified is, of course, the concept that is related to that signifier. And the key observation that Saussure came to was that the signifier itself is arbitrary. So when you think of any word in any language, the meaning and the word are not really tied together. It could be anything, which is why we have different languages and different words for the same concept, right? The concept is the same, but the word for that concept is different in different languages. So since that's the case, the only way we can figure out what everybody's talking about is by figuring out how this particular sign is related to other signs. And again, a key contribution of Saussure, a key observation that he came to was that the way we do this is by not providing a positive definition of something, but by providing a negative of what something is not, or how something is different from something else. So in other words, we are doing a subtraction, essentially. When you think about it, it kind of starts making sense if you think, let's say, of a word tree and word bark. Bark not as in dog barking, but a bark of a tree. So if you think of all the different things that are associated with the word tree, and also all the different things that are associated with the word bark, if you subtract one from the other, if you're trying to figure out what bark is relative to the tree, you take away all the things that are associated with the tree, and the only thing that should be left is only the things that are associated with the word bark. And that way you can kind of figure out what that is, right? So all those associations, we do them almost instantly. We don't really think about it. But the way children learn is they have to do this kind of work sort of manually, and it takes years for a child to build up this, what we talked about, kind of like a graph of all these connections of what different concepts and what different signs mean. And then we arrive at this rich system, right? A system of language that has all kinds of, we can express all sorts of meanings using these signs, using these relationships of a signifier and a signified. Once you do that in one language, it becomes pretty easy to do it in a different language, because then you just use that scaffolding essentially and build around it, tying different signifiers to the same signified, right? So you know what a concept is in English, and then you say, well, okay, what is that word in a different language? You can just associate it very quickly to what you already know, and then it becomes easier, perhaps. Which is why children, when they learn multiple languages, can do it pretty quickly. They can build up these graphs from multiple languages pretty easily, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Okay, so that was last time. That was Ferdinand de Saussure. Now enter Roland Barthe. Roland Barthe is an interesting character. He lived in the first half of, well, not first half, I guess. He was born around the beginning of World War I. One of his parents, his father actually died in World War I when he was very little. And he studied in Paris. He studied Greek mythology. That was his original, his degree was in Greek mythology. And then he went on to study philology and linguistics after that. And in the 50s, I think it was around 1957, he wrote kind of a first really famous work that he's known for, and this is the work that we're going to be talking about today, called Mythologies. Now, in some ways, when I approached this book, I thought, okay, well, the guy studied Greek mythology, and the book is called Mythology, so I'm probably going to read something about Greek mythology, but that's not what he's talking about at all. He's talking about mythologies of today. And at first, the book kind of throws it because it goes into something more akin to like sociology or something like that. But then towards the end, he has this section where he steps back. So he starts with kind of an inductive method. And then he says, okay, well, we talked about all these different things that are happening today, but let's step back and analyze what is a myth. And to maybe give a kind of heading to this entire topic, I'll just quote him and give you his answer to what myth is, because I feel like it's pretty rich and it can stimulate the discussion right there. So he says that, I'll just read. What is a myth today? I shall give at the outset a first very simple answer, which is perfectly consistent with etymology. Myth is a type of speech. So I'll let that kind of percolate. Myth is a type of speech. Well, that's pretty interesting. How did he arrive at that? I mean, when I think about myth, I think of a story, but I'm not really thinking of myth as a type of speech. But why does he say that? Well, the reason he says that is because he thinks that speech is communication, which it is. And just like we were talking about a second ago, the reason we use these signs is to communicate, right? We want to communicate ideas, so we utter words, signifiers that are associated with signifiers, these concepts, and so we can understand each other. A myth is a similar concept, but it's not the same, right? I mean, it's pretty clear that myth is not the same as a word. But Barthe actually traces how we can get from the level of language, linguistics, and individual words to the level of myth and mythology. And what he shows is that the function of that is exactly the same. Just like we're using words to communicate, myths are used to communicate. Now, how do we get there? Well, he doesn't really go into kind of more general explanation, but when I was reading this and thinking about it, it's actually akin to, and I might have mentioned this before, and this is probably familiar to you if you have mathematical background. There's something called this idea of closure or openness. In mathematics, if you perform an operation, and the result of that operation is something you can perform that's is something that you get as a result of that operation is the same thing you start from, then the operation is said to be closed in that sense. So a simple example is if you have numbers, integers, whole numbers, and you do addition, you're always going to end up with integers. So integers are closed under addition. If you do division, then that's not a closed operation because you can end up with something that's not an integer. If you divide something that doesn't evenly divide into something else, then that doesn't work. But addition is a closed operation. So bringing this back to language, as we said earlier, and this was another observation by Saussure, is a system. And if you know anything about systems, systems are closed under system formation. Elements of a system are closed under system formation. What that means is if you start out with particular elements and they form a system, whatever you end up with can then be used as a building block for the next level of next hierarchy of systems. So in language, what this means is you start out with words, you can formulate sentences, and then sentences themselves can be put together to formulate higher order meanings. Looking at the operation of individual words and myths is the same type of sequence where you start out with a signifier, like a particular word, let's say tree. Well, let's use Barth's example. So let's use the word rose. So rose, the word, a four-letter word, right, is a signifier of a concept of this beautiful flower, rose. We end up with having a sign, right? A sign that's composed of signified and signifier. Now, that sign can itself acquire additional semantic meaning. So we all know what rose is associated with, what the connotations are of a flower rose, something to do with love or passion. So now we have a signifier. That signifier is no longer the word rose, but the sign rose, right? Because it could be a picture, it could be something you hear, it could be written down or whatever, but it's no longer just that signifier, it's the whole thing, it's the sign itself. The sign of rose has this connotation of passion or love or some sort of emotion. Well, more specifically, passion. So now we end up having a new sign that has as its foundation this ready-made material of rose, the original signifier, the lower level. We have built a second order system now on top of the original one. So now we have this idea of passionate rose. Now that passionate rose is not the end of this process. A passionate rose can now be in itself a new signifier for a new signifier. It can now participate in larger contexts where it's not just rose the flower, it's not just a passionate rose, but now it might have some additional meaning. And this is the process where we go from individual words to the level of myth. And myth in Barth's exposition is this type of speech that brings it or includes in itself the connotations that are assigned to it. Now, these, of course, are not arbitrary and they're not individual. In order for it to work, just like with language, they have to be socially constructed and they have to be socially navigated and communicated, right? If I make up some kind of meaning with a particular signifier, that's not going to work unless other people take up and agree with me that this is a correct or workable or interesting or useful sign. So somebody says, okay, rose is hope. So yeah, that's very good. We'll talk about it in just a second how the question comes up is, well, are these connotations fixed or are they in fact malleable? And Barthe initially, based on his system, it sounds like once it's formed, just like with language, it's pretty fixed. I mean, with language, we said that even though the individual signifiers are arbitrary, once they're put in place, that's it. You can't, we can't make up new words whimsically, right? We can't just come up with a complete new graph of these connections. We have to build on top of what's there. In the same way, the question might be asked, well, are these second order signs also arbitrary? And Barthe says, no, they're not. So this is a big difference between the original formation, where the original signifiers were completely arbitrary, but the second order signifier signs are not. And the reason they're not is because they use the form of the original sign as a metaphor that ties that sign to the connotation that it wants to associate with itself. So there's something about roses in their nature that's not arbitrary, that is tied to passion. I mean, it's not too hard to try to figure that out. Maybe the color, blood, passion. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you can think of that will serve as kind of the building block, the origin for this new, the second order meaning. But it's interesting that this secondary process is not arbitrary at all. It is tied to the form of the original sign. So I think I've covered a lot of territory here. So I want to stop to make sure, first of all, that I'm communicating this clearly. And if there are any questions or maybe just feedback from you guys, what you think about this idea of what we talked about before with Saussure and what we're talking about with Barthe and the second order semantics, if you will.
All right, folks, if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and type an exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom. The first one up is Jeannie. Jeannie, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself, Jeannie.
At one point, he says everything is a myth. Now, that must be a myth itself, because how could everything be a myth unless he's just telling us that everything is a myth? And well, anyway.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't really gotten to the critique of this, right? So, this is, so far it's been an exposition of his thinking, but there are a lot of issues with everything he says, and we'll get to the critique in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to make sure that the original concept makes sense to everyone. Are we clear about the difference between word formation in a language and this idea of myth formation as kind of second order system on top of language, and how he thinks it functions?
If you folks would prefer, if anybody would prefer, you're welcome to state it in your own words, and then we can have Phil look at it and comment on it to get, a surer grasp on what is being said. So if somebody's, would like to volunteer to do that, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. If you have any comments about, both Saussure's views and these views, you're welcome to comment on anything. Allison, go ahead.
It sounds like what he's talking about is the difference between denotation and connotation. Because words can have, like, I don't know, when I teach that difference between, I always say Halloween, because Halloween could just mean it's a holiday, the last day of October, but it also means scary. So sometimes words have, like you're trying to explain what a word is to somebody, but then words have all these other meanings beyond it. That, I mean, what is kind of interesting, this whole idea of myth, is that I saw the Barbie movie this week, and it's filled with all sorts of myth and all sorts of, things that I hadn't even really considered till watching that, but it is kind of interesting, all the modern day myths that surround us at all times that we don't even really think of. They're just kind of a part of our, I don't know, our world without really recognizing it. I even, I watched the video of Cyrano yesterday, and I was noticing that there was a big conversation about why are women attracted to bad boys? Because that's another sort of myth sort of thing. And I wanted to answer it. It's not just because they're good looking. It's because for a lot of girls, especially teenage girls, there's so much pressure on them to be good and to be successful and to get good grades. And it's those boys represent a freedom from that. You know, it's like those kinds of boys, and then you see them everywhere. You see like pirates and Johnny Depp, and I don't know, there's such a myth about that, but it's really because they could care less about any of the rules. And especially teenage girls who are very concerned with following all the rules, it's the one place where they don't have to do that. But it is, the whole thing of myths is interesting. I mean, there's so many movies and things that involve the same kind of myths over and over and over again. It's like, I don't know, it's fascinating, really, but go see Barbie, it's very good.
Thank you. Go ahead, Phil, would you like to add anything?
Well, I want to say that, first of all, absolutely. Barbie and all really like movies like that are filled with modern day mythology. And that's where, you know, Barthe really starts out. He starts out by talking about things that are completely mundane and unphilosophical, if you will. He talks about professional wrestling, and he talks about plastic and the myths that the connotations, if you will, that plastic evokes, which I thought was brilliant. You know, this idea that we have infinite plasticity as a ideal in our culture. This idea of non-commitment, right? Because plastic can be transformed into anything. And this idea of transmutation, right? This idea that you can be infinitely transmuted into anything, this fluidity, right? Absolutely, modern culture is producing myths using exactly the same process of associating existing signs and building on top of them, associating meaning on top of them. Now, a question I might throw back at all of you is, do you think that's the same process that was used in producing original mythology? Was it some sort of social phenomena of a society versus something that Owen Barfield postulated, which according to him, it's a reflection of an actual inner reality that we are no longer in tune with. So this is where Owen Barfield really departs from Roland Barthe. You know, they really diverge at this point, because according to Barfield, metaphors are not accidental. They're not just socially constructed. They're actually reflections of some deeper realities. Barfield, Barthe says, no, it's a historical process, and it's really postulated by, you know, whatever a society is going through. It's society creates these myths, and they're socially constructed and socially managed and so on. So this is a kind of an interesting, perhaps interesting discussion point.
Wonderful. I like that very much, you know, that you brought in Barfield. Same, you know, his friend C.S. Lewis holds the same thing. You know, in his Abolition of Man, he bemoans loss of the Tao, you know, loss of universal principles around which can explain all of the variation instead of being focused on the 10,000 things. And so it's a dramatically different metaphysical view. Thanks for pointing that distinction out. Next up is going to be Katie, Joe, Jeannie, and Mike. Katie.
Well, I think you're kind of answering my question, but I was going to just go from rose the thing to the association. Now I'm just going to share my thoughts because we kind of already answered it. But the rose might be in our society, might be because of our holidays that we have. We might give flowers or something, so we make an association. Whereas, like in a fairy tale, you know, and I'm not up on my fairy tales, but a flower might be actually like a poison or something. You know, like something that, you know, that looks good, but that is going to deceive you. Or I haven't brushed up on my fairy tales for a long time, but I bet you'd find it in there somewhere.
Thank you, Katie. I wanted to add one more thing here. Another line of thought that we have explored in 52 Living Ideas is mythology based on the work of Carl Jung, people like Carl Jung, what's his name? The Power of Myth, Joseph Campbell, Jordan Peterson, and all of them are, look at myths from different cultures all together across all times and concentrate on the patterns, common patterns that emerge from it, which they see as being a reflection of the self. So it's very close, that approach is closer to the Barfield approach or C.S. Lewis approach as compared to Barthe. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Jeannie. Joe.
Yeah, just let me go off of that for a moment. So it's kind of, if it is inner, that you're going to come up with something that's more universal. That's my understanding. That's across cultural, versus if it's something that a society created. That's not necessarily everything's going to be unique to that particular society at that particular moment in time. So, I mean, that is a dramatic shift, because it tells you whatever, is there something in us that's telling us a story that we need to consider. I mean, does it come from the inside or does it come from the external? I mean, I don't know the answer. I'm still thinking about it, but that's the way I'm thinking about it. And I really appreciate the Barfield example, because yeah, I mean, you're really kind of saying, do universals exist, is the way I'm taking it. And I don't, I'd like to, if you give me the right answer, not just an answer, the right answer to that question, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. And I think you put your finger on the core issue here. And in my understanding, it's not just inner. It's not inner versus outer. It is inner and outer versus the temporary. It is the eternal in the universe and eternal in you, the constant in you, versus the temporal things. It is the thou versus the 10,000 things. It is the Brahma and Atma in the Gita tradition versus Maya or Prakriti, different things. So that is the difference between, it's like inner and outer together. It's like center and everything versus particular things and progression of particular things. Does that make sense to you, Joe?
Absolutely does. Yeah. No, I mean, that means, yeah, that there are certain, we were actually having a conversation about the idea of truth earlier. So that there's a certain agreed upon idea of what is between right and wrong. I mean, that's the way I'm also kind of seeing this as well. But I do think it is an inner and outer relationship as well.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Jeannie. Jeannie, go ahead.
Well, I've heard the word story a couple times, but he didn't actually say the word story. Maybe it doesn't exist in French or something, but until about page 140. But, what would be the difference between a myth and a story? And then, are these things, they need to be held in common. So just as you have a word, I mean, if you're using words that other people don't understand, then the communication breaks down. And if your story is different than the other stories of people around you, then I think the myth begins to break down too. And maybe that also stops communication. And then just to throw this in, I think this was before the use of the word meme, but we use that a lot. I mean, that's sort of like a standalone, non-moving story. I mean, just a snapshot of a story or something, maybe. I'm not sure how that would work in on this.
I can
Go ahead.
try to answer that. So the different, right? So myth is a story, right? Myth, we said that myth is a type of speech according to Barthe. So a story is speech, right? It's expression of some thought, your thinking. However, the difference is that a myth is a story, but not every story is a myth. And the difference is that myths touch upon something that is universal and not just incidental to whatever story you're telling, right? So let's maybe trace it. Let's use an example. Let's start with a signifier, rock. Okay, word rock, concept rock. Okay, second order meaning for that might be burden, right? We take that sign and we assign a new signifier, a new signifier to that, burden. Rock means burden. Okay, it's still not myth yet. It's more of a metaphor at this point. You know, it's poetic, it's not literal. And then we take myth of Sisyphus. And so Sisyphus now builds on this idea that we are familiar with, a heavy rock, a heavy burden, but now it's encapsulated in a mythological context. Now that we say Sisyphus, I'm doing Sisyphus's work or something like that. And immediately you have the whole picture now. And of course, Barthe uses similar examples where he talks about a picture of a Negro soldier saluting the French flag, and how that encapsulates all of these mythologies in it and creates second order meanings and meanings beyond the literal. So that's not just any story, it's a story that is, you know, kind of universal within that social context. Maybe it's not universal to us anymore, and maybe it's not the same level of mythology as Sisyphus or some of the Greek myths, but it is a myth in that culture. And but a story could be, you know, I went to school and read a book, you know, that's also a story, but that doesn't really do anything. It doesn't touch upon anything. It doesn't really create a meaning that I can then use as a building block in that system of hierarchy of meanings and hierarchy of concepts. So maybe, I hope that maybe clarifies a little bit.
Thank you, Phil. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Steve. Mike, 2 minutes, please.
2 minutes, 1 minute. The issue of the story, the closed system, like the American Dream or the Barbie culture, Barbie doll culture is that. Does the story of Flatland that says what would it be like living in a two-dimensional world, does that come into that area of a myth to explain to have a simplified version of basic principles? The Garden of Eden and the fall of man, how far can you extend it, and how far can you self-contain it, and where does consistency fit into that? Or is that part of the semiotic closure system?
Yeah, I think it never ends, Mike. I think based on what, you know, Barthe is talking about, and this idea of systems theory of, you know, these operations are being closed, and so it never ends, you know, and we keep building and building on top of existing myths. And the memes today, what are they? I mean, they really take advantage of the mythology of yesteryear, right? They incorporate a lot of the thinking, a lot of the signification that has already occurred. I think of symbols. Symbols can be used interchangeably with at this point with signs, because symbols are also not arbitrary, and the form of a symbol is associated with its meaning. So think of something like the cross as a symbol. It has a lot of meaning, has a lot of connotations, but it's used in all kinds of ways that are way beyond the original connotation of Christianity or sacrifice or all of those original meanings that were involved. I mean, think of the work of Salvador Dali and his rendition of Christ, you know, crucified. That has all kinds of extra additional meanings on top of the kind of the traditional. So all of those things, I think they just keep going on and on and on, which is super interesting, right? Because you have this, it's turtles all the way down or all the way up.
That's Phil, that's a great example of really powerful myths, powerful ideas, which act as a seed So there is that seed of ideas. There is something universal about the cross, something universal. For example, it captures like death and rebirth at the same time. It is the idea of Renaissance really captured. And that's something that is not just in that particular situation, but it is something that is happening in us all the time. It is like when Barfield talks about felt transformation of consciousness, that is the cross. There was a consciousness before, and in that moment of beauty, in that moment of aesthetics, something new was born in your consciousness. And because it is so beautiful and that metaphor goes to the heart of the human condition, it can act as a seed that can sprout so many different renditions, and both in words as well as images like Dali, that it is incredible. So in that sense, it is one, because it's the seed, and it is many, but there is a pattern that remains constant through that. So there is it's universal, and it generates a multitude of particulars from it, of this incredible variety, incredible plasticity, without it being an arbitrary progression. It is kind of coming back to the seed all the time. So thank you for bringing up that example. Next up is Steve.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
All right, thank you. I was thinking about how far, how much can be like reduced into universal ideas. Like what I mean by that is like a person can recognize himself in a mirror and say to themselves, oh, that's myself. But different cultures might view a rose differently. They might see it as love or maybe something really pointy. So I wonder, what are the fundamental and universal seeds that would lead to more interesting ideas based on that? Like, what is the specific idea which is center to all of the other building blocks?
Steve, that's an amazing question. Phil, would you like to take a stab at it?
Would I like to answer a 1,000-year-old question, right, about the universals or particulars? So, I mean, Steve, thank you for asking that. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to solve it today or tomorrow. But what I can say, though, is that, I mean, this goes to the crux of the matter. And I talked about or mentioned Owen Barfield and C.S. Lewis and some of those thinkers who postulated that metaphors and myth are, in fact, reflections of underlying realities, eternal realities. And so there are myths that are universal, that would seem to support that idea, and also metaphors that seem to be universal that seem to support that idea. For instance, this unity between breath and spirit, not just in Greek, but in other languages, that would suggest that there's something going on here, that it's not just a linguistic phenomenon in one language or one culture. And there are others very similar to it that that's embedded in languages. And you can study languages and you can see these metaphors in different languages that are completely unrelated, and yet they have very similar pictures of reality embedded in them. So that's one argument. And then one theory about this, that in fact metaphors and this process of signification is not at all accidental, and that the fact that rose signifies passion, there is something deeper that underlies it, kind of like the idea of Platonic, progression of beauty and love. You're going from physical beauty to this idea of what does physical beauty actually signify? And is there something deeper here that goes all the way to this kind of beatific vision, right, of the divine? So these ideas are these concepts are definitely embedded in this discussion. Now, Barthe is much more cynical, not cynical, but he's much more pragmatic about it, and he thinks along the lines of what he himself observed happen in cultures, because in 20th century we saw mass media come to the forefront, and mass media is generating these myths like there's no tomorrow. And so he, Barthe observing this, he says, well, we know the process by which myths are made, and essentially we take building blocks of existing meaning, existing semantics, and we attach and mix and match and create new meanings that spread and solidify and become embedded into society in such a way that we no longer even think about it. And that's the measure of a true myth. When you no longer think about it, you just take it for granted, and you already have the meaning packaged into something, so that when we say Hercules, we already think about strength. And when we say American flag, we already have all sorts of meaning packed into that. That means that's done. That myth has already taken hold and is part of our almost subconscious thinking, right? We don't think consciously about all the things that are associated with flags or with medals or with ribbons or with this or that. It's part of our very deeply ingrained into us in our culture. And Barthe thinks, at least based on my reading of what he was describing as modern day mythologies, he thinks that this process is completely natural and is completely guided by the vicissitudes of culture and cultural evolution and the different forces that move in culture. But I want to say that your question actually leads us to the next point. I don't know if we're ready or not to proceed, but it pretty much exactly leads us to this next point about structuralism versus post-structuralism, because that's really the question. Are these things, are these meanings inherent and stable, or are they in fact fluid? And so I'll stop here, and Shrikant, let me know if you want to continue or want
Sure.
to.
I also wanted to comment on this, but I will hold off my comment until after the next section. So let's go to the next.
All right. So so the next observation to make is the following. So as we were talking about with Saussure and with Barthe, they both start with this from this place of meaning is derived not by positive association, but by negative comparison, by differences between things. And so we end up having this graph of relationships between signs, and the relationships between signs allow us to understand them and to make meaning out of them. Now, if you think about that, the implication of that is that this is a closed system that is completely static. Once it's established, we said that, once the signs, the signifiers are established, they can no longer change arbitrarily. So nobody can make up a new word arbitrarily. It just, you can say something nonsensical, but nobody's going to understand what you're saying. And so, these things are pretty much fixed. But then we talked about the second order, and the second order seems much more, the second order signification, or the buildup of these things on top of it, the buildup of semantics on top of the original layer of words, seems much more fluid. The question then comes in, okay, well, as Steve was asking, are these things in fact universal? And the structuralist approach would tend to say yes, because everything is related to everything else, and you have this kind of graph, right, of relationships, and you take a difference, one minus the other, and you kind of get at the meaning. The problem with that is, as we all know, if we look at a text, and most of these French philosophers, they started analyzing these texts, and they just started discovering new meanings in these texts. And of course, we know that this didn't just start with French philosophers. Think of the Bible and all the different interpretations of the Bible that have come down to us through the centuries. I mean, if you look at the rabbinical school of Jesus's time versus the Middle Ages versus the Protestant Revolution versus the Catholic reaction versus the Protestantism today. I mean, my God, it's everybody approaches it very, very differently, and they get different things out of it and different emphases. How can this be? We still have the same words, presumably linked with the same, with these same relationships to each other. How can we get a different meaning from a static text? And the answer to that, of course, is that these systems are not closed. They're open systems, meaning that the relationships inside the system are not the only thing that guides the creation and understanding and interpretation of the meaning. There are other things that are external to it that are, in fact, constantly changing and constantly in this feedback loop with the linguistic system. And so that relationship opens up this field of study to a new theory called poststructuralism, where the idea is it's not the relationships within the text or the relationship between the words. It's actually forces that are external to it, social forces, cultural forces that are guiding the creation of meaning. And Barthe, when he arrived at that eventually, this was years after he published the Mythologies book. In fact, it was 1968. He publishes his other most famous book called The Death of the Author. And the death of the author, as you can probably surmise from the title, is about the fact that the author doesn't have the final say in the interpretation of a work. It's the reader who is the author. The reader, the author is dead, but the author is reincarnated as you read a text, because you're bringing into it whatever you want to bring into it. Now, this is a radical departure from the traditional approach to interpreting texts. And this kind of blows up traditional approach to a lot of things. One of them is history. And I thought this was interesting because we talked about history last time, and we talked about how we will never have an ultimate history of anything. We will be rewriting history always. And the reason we are always going to be rewriting it is because we are in a dialogue with it. We ourselves are changing. And because we are changing, the types of questions we're asking are changing, and the types of emphases are changing, and our context is different, and our consciousness is different. And so therefore, the history is going to be different. Now, as far as Barthe is concerned, it's the same exact process, only related to language and text. Text is just a specific incarnation of language in writing, but it's the same system, right? It's the same system of meaning. It's the same system of signs. So I'll stop here. I think this is probably enough to maybe talk about.
All right, folks, if you have comments, go ahead and type an exclamation mark, and we will take it from there. We're going to start with Judy.
I have a really quick question. You may have answered it already. Is myth an open system?
Well, according to Barthe in 1968, yes, definitely. But probably even according to the earlier Barthe too, because again, he describes how culture formulates these mythologies, and the cultural currents are constantly shifting. And the things that France experienced in the 50s are different than what France experienced in 1968, with the student protests and so on. So obviously the mythologies are constantly changing. And perhaps when you show, let's take that same example of that image of a Negro saluting a French flag. In 1950, that was a sign of the stability, the fairness of the French Empire, right? But today, the connotations of that image are completely opposite, right? It's France is viewed as colonial, as oppressive, and so on. So same exact image, opposite meaning,
So they're constantly being rewritten,
right,
like the history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shrikant, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Judy. So I'm going to make a comment. This is going to be very tough because, Steve's question was very good. It actually goes to the heart of the matter. And actually this, I'm not able to talk particularly well about it, but I'm going to try. Because this is a very, very large issue. This is, on one hand, you can look at it as a philosophical issue of the conflict between Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus says everything changes. You can't step into the same river twice. Parmenides says, no, reality is the same. Change is an illusion. So that's the extreme situation. And then you have like Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle kind of, emphasizing the movement and the role of movement, and Plato kind of more emphasizing the constancy with some movement. So those are kind of a little bit, but again, kind of Plato being more towards Parmenides. Now, so there are several things. I think the way in which Steve phrased the question was very good, of saying, are there such things? And how do you get to such things? Okay. So let's look at what people have done. So firstly, if you're trying to get at such things, you have to have a lot of humility. Okay, if you just come up with something and say, this is it, then you are grabbing onto something which is that you yourself have created. And then you're trying to really, ape truth or reality, which it is not, which you don't have. So you have to have tremendous amount of humility of trying, inductively to look at it. So one thing I would say is that, so firstly, the thing that distinguishes Barthe from people like Jung, who are trying to do the same thing, is that they take, Jung takes a very large time frame and across a lot of culture of different stages of technology, and is trying to see patterns that are that are constant in that, change. There is clearly change, but if you look at the data large enough, there are some common patterns to it. People like Buckminster Fuller, for example, they look at universe as the totality of all of awareness and all of communications of everybody. And what they're trying to do in that process is that they're trying to take in all of these movements, and they're trying to check them against one another, compare them against one another, and using them to say, okay, what is it that is true for all human beings? So it's an inductive process of trying to get at it. There are really beautiful things that some of the ancients have come up with. Like, for example, Dao De Jing. We talked about the idea of the seed, which is very much part of the biblical corpus of metaphors. Similarly, there are metaphors like that in the Indian corpus. There are similar metaphors in the Chinese corpus. So, for example, the Chinese, my favorite summary of Dao De Jing is Bruce Lee's statement saying, "Be like water, my friend." Okay, that actually captures a lot. Water does all kinds of things. It can be in all kinds of states, and it can go everywhere. It can flow through everything, yet it is water. And it has the flexibility and the constancy, and it is malleable, yet the same. So that's another example of something. And this people have worked on for a long, long period of time. So you collect all of these things, and try to use all of them. And it's kind of like elephant in the room, in the dark room. You feel and you get some things. So you have to use multiple metaphors in order to try to get at reality. And the process of using the metaphors is our conscious process. And it is social process too. We learn from each other. Buckminster Fuller again does a great job, that it is all of humanity's culture that you have to look at as the starting point. So it is not, and the most important thing is that asking that question continuously to yourself is far more important than whatever answers that you might arrive at any point of time, you or anybody else, because that's what reality is like. So that's what how I would answer Steve's question. If anybody else wants to comment on anything that was said or this particular section, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Going to give about 10-15 seconds. Otherwise, we'll go to the next section. Let's go to the next section. Oh, wait a minute. Joe put 2 questions about. Joe,
You know, I had it there from before. So I was like, and I was just, you know, I just was thinking at this. Can you go back over, like, if it's the situation, if it's a static system, what is the result of that really quickly?
Sorry, say again?
If it's a static system that you're talking
Right,
about.
so structuralism, when you think about it, it assumes that this graph, once it's built, it's
It's
there.
static.
It's static
Right.
because if it's not, then how can you determine meaning? Right, meaning is determined by a subtraction of association of this sign versus that sign, and that's how you build up this graph in the first place. So if everything is kind of floating in space and not fixed, then how can you know what any particular word, what any particular expression, a metaphor, how can we know that anything means, right? That's the argument for kind of a more or less static fixed system. The counter argument, as I presented it, is that, well, while that's true in a sense, we also know that meanings of text, meanings of signs, meanings of symbols can change radically. So how can they how can that be in a static system?
Right. Okay. So yeah, I was just making that distinction. Actually, makes it very clear for me. So yeah, and I just needed to piece that part together. Thank you.
thank you, Joe. Great question. Next up is Jeannie.
So I think we're in an interesting point. So up until now, the Barbie myth is, she's a glamorous airhead. And now, I haven't seen the movie, but, maybe she's rewritten in some way to be, some kind of other character. But then what happens over time? Does that, 70 years, well, maybe not quite 60, probably years of her being an airhead, does that begin to take the new myth and drag it back down to, the old place? Or does it somehow, manage to survive, its history and be rewritten in our time? That would be an interesting thing. We'll find out, I suppose.
You know what? I think Allison wants to chime in here. She's the best person to deal with this question. So let's just have Allison. Allison, go ahead.
So one thing I really had not considered until I saw the movie was that before Barbie, all the dolls that came out were baby dolls. So girls were basically playing at being mothers. But Barbie was the first time that they had a doll that was supposed to be an adult woman. So it was that they could envision this future for themselves. And what I didn't realize, and I kind of like went back and started looking at the timing of things, that it was basically created by a woman who created Barbie. And what she did was these dolls originally started with Malibu Barbie, but then it went into all these dolls that they did everything. They were firefighters, they were astronauts, they had all these jobs that women didn't have yet. So these Gen X women like myself were playing with these dolls, and then they went out and then they did those things. And what's kind of interesting is I looked at the timing of this. I remember because I had it, the Barbie's Dream House. The first Barbie's Dream House came out in 1962. And what's interesting is they called it the Dream House, but in 1962, women couldn't get credit. They couldn't get credit until 1974. So it was only a dream that they could ever buy a house. So for 12 years, these little girls were playing with this house that eventually they got the right to be able to buy a house. So, and then also that over the years, the Barbies became very diverse. They had, they changed it. So they had like 50 million kinds of Barbies that really represented the diversity of the country and the world, really. So anyway, it was very interesting. Yeah.
Alison, great comment. I mean, it's a great example of what Phil is talking about. So thank you. All right, let's go to the next section.
Well, Alison actually gave me a perfect connector to what I wanted to talk about next, which is how this relates to cultural currents that create and guide the mythologies that really bind our society together. And so one way that this happens is, like, Alison mentioned that Barbie dolls were this first instance of a girl trying to have a model of what she could be as a grown-up woman. And of course, what is that picture that a Barbie doll portrays? What is a grown-up woman? Well, it's a woman that is very much focused on the way she looks, right? It's a woman that shops. So the idea of consumption and the idea of the material girl, right, if you will, is very much part of that. Now, I don't want to say that that is something that is a glue for our society, but it is definitely part of it. We are a society of consumers, and that's part of what how we deal with reality. We've really shifted from other pursuits, more maybe philosophical or other ideological pursuits, and we find meaning in the things that we own. Why is that? And it's not, a lot of people would say that's a bad thing, but, part of that you have to realize it's building an identity. That's, people associate things they own with who they are. And what you own is a statement about who you are, whether or not you have taste, whether or not you have certain preferences, and so on. Even a person who buys a Che Guevara a shirt is making a particular statement. It's very ironic that this person is participating in a capitalist economy, and yet is trying to make a statement about revolution and socialism and redistribution, while in fact purchasing, not stealing, mind you, but purchasing a T-shirt and supporting the mechanisms that make our society function as a successful capitalist, semi-utopia. So it's a very interesting, these myths, they, like I said, these things are open. The system building process never ends. And so the myths, they start from small, but they keep accumulating until to the point where they become things that actually bind society together. And there are two thinkers that I think agree with this interpretation. I wanted to bring them to this discussion. One is Emile Durkheim, who of course wrote a seminal work on religion as this system that essentially, its function is not particular beliefs, but its function is unifying society through various beliefs. And so how does this tie to what we're talking about? Well, myths are not really about truth. In fact, they are the opposite of that. Myths are, Barthe says myths are meant to distort reality. They're not meant to reveal. And this is maybe actually another difference with Barfield. Barfield would say that myths are there to reveal some inner, deeper truth. But Barthe says, no, that's not the case. Myths are there to distort reality, but it's not a bad distortion. The function of that distortion, or not, depends on where you're sitting from, bad or good. But the function of that distortion is to unite people and to create certain ways of coordinating people. So it's the same kind of idea that Emile Durkheim is talking about with religion. So religious myths, obviously are connected with all of this, right? Religion is the kind of the factory of mythology, if you will, right? We all, European society has been bound by religious myths for forever, right? The Christendom, right? The Crusades. Everything in the Western European society has been orchestrated and has been undergirded by a particular mythology. And when I say mythology, again, I'm using it in a wider sense, not in a sense that it's untrue, but in a sense that it is these systems of meaning that undergird a larger society. Another thinker from completely different side of things is Antonio Gramsci, a Marxist thinker. And what he was saying was that the means of power in society are not purely materialistic, that primarily means of control and power are in fact ideological. And so whoever controls ideology and whoever controls the formation of these myths, whether it's nation-making myths, right? Like we talked about in the sections on history, how a lot of history was made in the 19th century. And the interest in history really peaked in the 19th century when we had these nation states come to their peak of nationalism and peak of national sentiment. Everybody was all of a sudden interested. How did we come about? How did the Slavs come about? How did the Germans? How did the French, the Italians? All these national myths really came to the forefront, and they became an ideology. We see it today in the modern day conflicts, that you have these mythologies guiding war conflicts today. Russia and Ukraine is a perfect example of that, where you have myths on both sides, very strong myths of a particular ideological direction, land being considered sacred on both sides, things like that, that really empower them to do things that they wouldn't ordinarily dream of doing without them, right? If they didn't believe those things. So very powerful ideas that are really, again, the common denominator is this ability to create additional meaning, associate that meaning, and then communicate it to the rest of society. But once it's communicated, it becomes a hugely powerful thing. So I'll stop here.
All right. Folks, any comments, any questions? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark before we jump into it. Phil, how many more sections do you have?
This is pretty much it, actually.
Very good. Okay, so let's, so folks, now everything is fair game. So you can talk about this particular section, or you can bring up any theme that we have touched upon. Let's start with Joe.
Two things that I would like to expand upon. I mean, I think it might have been the political theorist John Rawls that had come up with the idea of the self-made man myth. That it was, and I think it had some, did some empirical evidence to prove that. So that would be a myth, though, that a cultural that would rally around, right? This idea that you do it all on your own, that you don't necessarily have any, need any assistance from anyone, which is actually interesting. If you look at it statistically, there is evidence to suggest that Americans subscribe to that in a number of different ways, by assigning a lot of a value to success of the internal trait of the actor, meaning the person themselves, as opposed to a group, more of a structural reason for success. And I'm just saying that that's one example of a myth. The other interesting part was the idea of the power structure influence. I think that was something that, because the power structure actually influences knowledge. And so that has a huge impact on how society operates, essentially, how norms get developed, and how institutions function. So those are just two quick thoughts that I had based off of what you had actually talked about. I do think that, if you control an ideology, that has the potential to be very powerful.
Phil, would you like to comment?
Yeah, only to say very quickly that, you know, the obvious conclusion there that Gramsci drew from his ideas was that if you want to destroy a regime or a society, instead of attacking its material base, like Marx would say, means of production, you know, controlling means of production, what you need to attack is the means of production, or to say that you need to destroy the ideology that binds the society together. And one of the dangerous things that I see today that's happening in a lot of the Western world is ideologies that have been used to bind our society, for better or worse, are being subverted, but nothing is offered in its place that is powerful enough. And so it leads to destabilization of society when you don't have anything else that binds it together. So one of the reasons that Soviet Union fell, and people are still debating what was the biggest cause, the primary cause, but probably it's a lot of things. But perhaps it's not so much economic. Perhaps economic is not the maybe it was the effective cause, but not the final cause, as Aristotle would say. But the final cause was that people lost faith in the ideology, and they no longer believed in it. Because when you think about it, people that lived in the 1920s in Russia and 1930s lived in horrific conditions, and yet they did not rebel. They did not, bring that system down. They went along with it. And one argument for that is they actually believed that their children were going to live a better life because of, the utopia of communism would come to fruition. But the people in the 1970s and 1980s were very, very much more comfortable. I mean, I lived in Russia at that time myself, and we were very comfortable, and there was no problem. I mean, we weren't hungry or anything like that. And yet these same people who were relatively well off brought the system down, and, basically imploded it from the inside. And so you can say, well, that's because the ideology was gone. The myths that were binding that society, they came under fire. And perhaps if you want to be a little sinister about it, you would say, well, it was the American propaganda or whatever that helped that. And, that's probably was a factor too. But anyway, all of that to say that ideologies could bring a system down, or they could cement the system. And we see historically both things happening. Western Europe was held together by Christianity for a very long time. Now we see Islam as the kind of the binding factor in a lot of the Asian countries. What does the West have to offer in its place? It's not, it's not clear yet to me that we have an ideology that has that same potency and same mythological, or not so much mythology, but same power of meaning that that Christianity used to have. So that's my comment.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. So you're saying that man does not live on bread alone.
By bread alone, yes. Contrary to Marx.
Yeah. Thank you. Next up is Allison, followed by Jeannie. Folks would love to hear what you guys thought about this entire subject. Any comments are welcome. Okay, feel free to disagree with anybody on anything. Just do so courteously. Allison, followed by Jeannie. Allison.
What I think is kind of interesting is that when you look at myths in the past, so many of them were about things that they were confused about, like what's the moon? What's it doing up there? What's the sun doing? So they create this myth around it. And we've done kind of the same thing. Like, we sent men to the moon, and then we had all sorts of tons and tons and tons of TV shows, movies about space, because we were trying to make sense of it in a way. But what is interesting is the idea of how technology is affecting our myth making right now, because it used to be, really not even that long ago, everybody had cable TV and they'd watch, okay, we had like 100 channels, but at least we all had the same 100 channels. And now, many of us have cut the cord and everything's streaming, and there's no like commonality in terms of what we watch on a screen. And even with music, like music was this thing that would tie together. Each generation could remember the music from, high school and college. But now because of, Spotify and, everyone's listening to completely different things, and nothing's unified anymore. So when nothing is unified, how do you create myths? Or maybe that's why everything is so diverse. It's like we've got all these different, camps in this country, but there's nothing unifying them. And maybe part of the reason for that is because technology has had this big, profound effect. It's like not something people really thought about or planned, like, oh, let's just have choices. But when we have all these choices, there's no myth to follow. And there's nothing unifying us anymore. So I don't know what the future holds with that, but it's kind of an interesting idea.
So Alison, that's a really fascinating topic. It's so it so happened that people who control the TV channels may take the time before cable. Only very few people who could broadcast to the whole nation basically decided what the content was. Okay, if you want to take a more extreme version of it, look at the Soviet Union that Phil was talking about. Only the set things are there, and only that will be pumped out. Now, what we have now is that people can, there is the diversity, tremendous diversity. Anybody can produce content. Anybody can get the content that they like. And so it's kind of fragmented as a result of that. And it's really interesting. So it's like, this difference between spreading out and constancy, the idea of many and one. And how do you achieve one while respecting the nature of many? That is a very large political, psychological, philosophical problem. Because traditionally, it has been solved in a top-down. Let's find a benevolent monarch who will dictate things, and we will just follow that. There is the other model, which the founding fathers came up with, where you say that you create structures for the individuals in order to protect. So it's a very complex system, far more complex than top-down monarchy, but it allows for freedom and kind of exploration, pushback, and reintegrating new things in a structured way. And so it's a very large issue of this one and many. Isn't it amazing that in this discussion, we are talking about these deep philosophical issues of individual and society, one and many, eternal and temporal, and we're just doing that as the discussion progresses. So thank you so much, Alison. Next up is going to be Jeannie, followed by Joe. Jeannie.
Well, I was actually going to say the same thing as Alison, and even to the point that we're targeted, by media as to what we're, what we're going to see and what we're not going to see. But on the other hand, I think if something is very, very compelling, we also have the ability to, get it through the society. I mean, there aren't so many people that are living, as hermits in the United States or whatever. We can get to those people in some way. I mean, if it means something to us. But the other thing I wanted to talk about was, I really like the one about the soap and detergent, because that was an eye opener for me, having grown up with, detergent as a staple, I should say. But, one of the things that he pointed to is the reaction that, and this should be pretty much universal, you know, the way we feel about bubbles and the way we feel about soft things, and, you know, that there's some things that are pretty much universals to the human just because of their physicality. And those things, you know, we should be able to somehow get the myth to, and I mean, everybody uses detergent now, you wouldn't be without it, but you know, is it only because
Sorry,
of bubbles?
you might want to give a little more context there, because for people that haven't read that section, they probably don't know what the hell you're talking about as far as soap and detergent. Barth has a section on the commercials for detergent that came out during the Cold War. And there, the detergent was seen as this, it wasn't just the idea of cleaning, it was the idea of regaining, kind of freeing territory from germs, essentially. Like it was the idea of battle, not just the idea of like you're participating in this cosmic battle of good versus evil. It wasn't just cleaning dirty clothes anymore. It was presented as this idea. Sorry, Jeannie, I interrupted you. Go ahead. I just wanted to make sure it was people were aware of this context, because for those who haven't read that chapter on mythology around that. Go ahead, Jeannie.
Well, you said it better than I did, but there was, I mean, it was a little more complex in that about the bubbles were feeling that we are getting airy and lightweight. And, you know, I feel that way about bubbles. So I think it's universal, but I'm not sure.
Right. So that actually, it's a great point. I want to comment on it really quickly, because if you remember what we said in the beginning was that the difference between myth as part of speech or a type of speech and just a signifier at the base level is that the form of the thing below it, at a level below it, is tied to the semantics. So with bubbles, the form of a bubble, the ideas, the physical description of what a bubble is necessarily tied to this new semantical association of a connotation, right? Of being light and being radiant and so on. And so that is what's used by the advertising to create this new mythology that we don't, you know, again, was part of the popular culture and I guess in the 50s or 60s, but maybe not with us anymore. But according to Eugenie, it's still, you still have that same idea of
Feeling, but actually I mean, detergents are made with a lot less bubbles now. I mean, they debate on how many bubbles to put in there because the bubbles are bad, but
because the idea maybe outlived itself, right? The Cold War is over. We don't need to we don't need to engage in battle with germs anymore.
Thank you, Ginny. Next up is Joe.
One thing that I read, and I don't know if you had come across it at all, was the idea of structuralism with psychology in particular, and how words and how we connect words actually form our thoughts and actually our emotions. But they also talked about it in the sense that how it didn't necessarily account for the unconscious. And I was just wondering if you had seen anything when you were doing your reading on structuralism related to that specifically, because I'm just thinking about it in terms of post-structuralism would then include the myth aspect of things, which would be kind of like tapping into the unconscious, like in a way, right? Am I thinking about that correctly? And I'm just thinking about this in terms of that's I just read a little bit about the how it impacted, how structuralism specifically impacted psychology when I was reading about structuralism originally. This is going back to our original meetup.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I haven't read anything about the unconscious and structuralism, which in itself to me is significant that perhaps that's the whole point. It doesn't really tap into that because structuralism is all about this rational process of, you know, creating these connections and meanings from relationships, very much, you the idea of unconscious, the idea of something that we cannot control, that in fact controls us and controls meaning, and in fact spills over into things like meaning of words and myths, to me seems much more post-structural theme than a structural theme, because that's where the question then comes up, well, where do you what feeds that unconscious? What feeds those unconscious drives and neuroses, right, that produce specific meanings or produce specific connotations. So yeah, it seems to me that would be in the post-structuralist camp.
Thank you, Phil. I'm thinking of people like Carl Jung and the way in which they deal with conscious and unconscious. Also thinking of Gestalt, where they make this distinction between figure and ground. So this entire theory seems to be about the figure of whatever it is that seems to be conscious, that people are conscious of. And there is a ground on which this entire thing is going on, which is much, 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 much larger. It has lots of potentials, positive and negative, out of which some of these figures actually end up coming. And this is a way of whereas somebody like Jung is very much aware of both the figure and the ground at an individual level and at a social level. And they are always thinking of, whenever they're thinking of trying to understand what is happening in the conscious, they're always trying to say, okay, what is the role of what you don't know? It's like order and chaos, right? And city in the forest. So you're just focused on the city and whatever has been built in the city. But the growth of the city itself is coming from people going out into the forest, figuring out new things, bringing it back to the city. And so, I think that's how I think of it, because people like Jung are far more comprehensive. They are actually respecting the unknown, and not just known unknown, but even unknown unknown. And they're making allowances for that in their philosophy and their way they think. All right, next up is Mike. Mike, you got 2 minutes. Go ahead.
I need only 30 seconds, but I would like to reserve a portion of that time for the extra time for a follow-up, if I may.
Sure.
In many other fields, and I've always thought of myth as a model. And models, and it's a model in words or a model in stories. Now, just as in economics and every other field, there are advantages and limitations of models. And do you buy into that? I see you nodding your head. You buy into that concept? And if so, what do you see as some of the limitations of models, of that kind of modeling? As Plato said, the map is not the territory, and that model is a territory. Can you expand on that and permit me to have another 15 seconds for a follow-up?
Sure,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I do think that there is a relationship, and it's as follows. A myth is a generalization of a specific phenomena that we all experience. So that's the model. But the limitation is that it's not specific. So we may have a situation like, we read about Oedipus, and there are all kinds of general principles there, one of which is the limitations of our knowledge, and the fact that knowledge doesn't necessarily bring fulfillment, satisfaction, in fact can bring us demise. That's a very general model of behavior. However, it doesn't help us always with specific things, right? That's the limitation. It's not going to tell you, in this specific instance, should I just abandon knowledge or not? Just like in Proverbs, you have all these Proverbs in the Bible. Some of them will say, correct the fool. The others will say, don't correct the fool, run away from him. So opposite directions, basically. So that's the mythology. Sometimes myths they're these general constructs. And I guess where wisdom comes in, practical wisdom, is understanding which myth, which mythology to apply. Just like when you're dealing with mathematical or economic models, you need to be knowledgeable to figure out, okay, this model no longer works. I need to throw it out and use a different one, right? So it's the same kind of thing in one sense. Now, I think myths are much more interesting and rich than mathematical models, which are somewhat cold, abstract, and vacuous. And they're much more, I would say they've stood the test of time much better than models that we've used in the past in even astronomy, right? Think of the Ptolemaic model of the universe. Yeah, it's been used for a very, very long time. It was good enough until it wasn't anymore. And then we decided to throw it out, and now we don't use it at all. But mythology has stood the test of time, where the same myths that have guided us for thousands of years are still guiding us today to a degree, right? The mythology of, I mean, for better terms, since we've been talking about it, the cross, and this idea of sacrifice, right? Sacrificing your well-being for another person, this idea of mercy. I mean, these are all extremely robust ideologies and myths that have stood the test of time, and it doesn't look like we're going to throw them out anytime soon, as opposed to some of the other models.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, I think you answered it so thoroughly, I don't need a follow-up, but I'll think about it and maybe raise my hand again.
All right, and you have reserved 1 minute of your time, 2 minutes. You can come back for another 2 minutes, Mike. I find that with a short time, you do amazingly. You produce for if I give you half the time, you produce twice or thrice the value. So thank you so much. Amazing. Next up is Joe.
So it's interesting about the idea of myths, because some of the things, and this obviously post-structuralism is a little bit later, but in another meetup that I was in a discussion, it was the idea that myth was a precursor to philosophy. And so that it enables philosophy in a certain way, that it enables us to understand very deep concepts that then can turn into kind of formal systems of like thought. Anyway, I thought that that's kind of interesting when you're talking about the power of myth. Then how does that myth actually make its way into some kind of system and reality for which you could actually live your life by? So if you have something like a myth, or if you're addressing some, I don't know, any kind of, I'm trying to think of a myth offhand, but any myth, how that can actually lead to how we follow our own principles. I don't know. That's any thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Phil.
Okay, so I guess the first part of that was whether mythology predates philosophy and is a precursor to it.
Well, yeah, that it was. Yes, actually, that it is a precursor to philosophy.
Okay, I mean, I agree with that. I think that's spot on. And then what was the second part of that?
Well, that's pretty much it. Then it actually leads to a system. Well, it leads to a system of thought from there, so that it can, bring in new concepts into reality and even how to live.
Right. So I guess, this is where, to me, it's interesting to compare the myth-making process that was experienced thousands of years ago versus the myth-making process that we experience today. So I would, Barthe seems to me to imply that it's the same process. And I'm not sure I completely buy that, because I feel like initially all of this was much more spontaneous and much more driven by kind of Jungian type psychological, processes within us. It wasn't really controlled. Whereas today there is an element of control in our myth making, and so when you control it, you don't have to believe it necessarily, right? You can just, you're producing an ideology that you don't necessarily buy into yourself. So I would imagine that people that produce Barbie movies, or that particular Barbie movie, they probably are not like necessarily super consumers and buying into the pink, wearing pink whatever dresses and so on, as much as perhaps the people that will be watching it. Whereas I want to think that the primitive, and when I say primitive, I'm talking about original, not primitive as simplistic. The primitive man, when all of these myths, they were basically almost like a stream of unconsciousness emerged. There was no question about whether or not you believed it. It was just part of nature. It was part of you. And so all of these raw emotions and raw experiences of the world, and this idea of man becoming conscious and self-conscious of himself, and trying to figure out what this world is, it was kind of crystallized in mythology first, and then crystallized further into religion. And then as we started that feedback loop of reflective introspection into it, that's when it became philosophy and science eventually. But it wasn't very much self-directed, where now, again, people are constructing ideologies, constructing myths at will. And therefore we have a multiplicity of myths, but at the same time, they're not as durable. So the myths are multiplying at a tremendous pace, but the quality of them obviously goes down, and the durability of them goes down. Whereas originally we only have, a very finite number of very specific, influential myths, and they will probably stay with us forever as long as humanity is alive.
Thank you. I just want to point out one thing about just the numbers here. The number of people on Earth today is so many times more than what we're talking about at the, biblical times, Greeks,
Right.
Egyptians at that time. So that's one. Second is that percentage of people today who are capable of producing, communicating myths is so much more. It's many, many times what it used to be at that time. Third, we are in the present. So there are, as you know, myths are born, and most of the myths die out. And only some of them are transmitted. The myths that, when we think of the old myths, these are the myths that have lived. It's likely that there will be a very large percentage of myths produced at that time that died out, that we are not. So we are focused on only the ones that have survived. Whereas when you're looking at the old myths, when you're looking at the new myths, we are surrounded by all the myths that are being produced right now. And you can see it with people who have lived long enough. They can say, in the 1950s, this was there, but it's no longer there. So the entire, and human memory actually forgets it too. So we are kind of, the way in which we're looking at the older myths and new myths is biased by just these numbers and the durability of myths. Thank you. Next up is going to be Jeannie. Jeannie, go ahead.
Well, vis-a-vis the philosophy versus myth, I think for Barthe, he's more hinting that these things are slipped over on us, that we're unaware of what, we're being guided to do. Whereas with philosophy, you're actually, thinking about things. With a myth, it's just something that takes a hold of you unawares.
Phil, would you like to comment on that?
Only to say that in my experience, I agree with Jeannie. I would say that, if you go to an opera and you just listen and don't do any sort of, you're enjoying the music, it's one experience. If you start analyzing, it's a different experience. I'm not saying you're not enjoying it, but it's a different type of experience. And so perhaps mythology is in fact kind of like listening to music in these two ways. You can just kind of let it affect you as it is, more like an unmediated way. right? Or you can involve the intellect, and it becomes a completely different experience. So maybe that's the
Thank
same
you.
distinction.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's a difference between art and science and how you experience art and science. You know, art by its nature is experienced directly in emotion, whether you're listening to music, whether you're reacting to visual arts, it just speaks to you directly and to your emotions. Whereas science, you're focused on what is it. So even philosophies, you know, take like theology. Theology is converted into myths, and they will speak to you, you know, whether it is Michelangelo's Pieta or, you know, the Sistine Chapel will speak to you directly. But if you're trying to read theology like Aquinas, that is very hard work, and the way it works is different. And many of the religious texts actually combine both of these things, where you have characters, you have stories, which act as art, and they contain a lot of explicit philosophy within it. So they are kind of mixtures of both. If you go further back, there isn't that much speeches. It's all carried in the actions, and you're responding to that. So it is like living ideas, you know, it is the live, you know, you can express it as a living being that epitomizes that idea as art, or you can talk about ideas themselves, you know, what is the basis of it, how did you come up with it, and that's a different process. Thank you, Ginny.
Can I comment on that?
Please.
You know, it's very interesting that you say that, that you break it into art and science. So I want to say that in you know, today, if you go to higher education institutions, typically if you take a course in music or visual arts, you know, it's an art class, both of them, but what they'll teach you is analysis. So when I took a class, I was required to take these like general courses, general ed courses. Okay, so they say, okay, we're going to teach you this stuff so you can enhance your appreciation of music or of painting and so on. And so in an art class, they'll teach you about the form and the lines and the color and how to analyze a painting from different perspectives and so on. However, what I found is even after I learned that, I'm not getting much more aesthetical experience than when I just look at the painting. I can analyze a painting better now than I was able to before, but that's a completely different experience. It's not an aesthetic experience. It's an intellectual experience, and it's a different experience. Same with music. If I listen to Tchaikovsky and I start to analyze, okay, this is the first part, and oh, I see what he's doing here. I'm not enjoying it. I am analyzing it, and I can't do both at the same time. That's what I found. You cannot do both. You're either going to enjoy it and just listen to it, or you're going to analyze it, but you can never do both. And so it's interesting to me that in our higher education institutions, the appreciation is actually kind of getting stunted. I know they're trying to do that. They're trying to increase your aesthetic appreciation for finer, you know, points in life and finer expressions of art. But actually, it's analysis. And the art is dwindling, and the science, if you will, is increasing. So there's a disproportion in art versus science. There is no artistic experience anymore of that. In fact, I would argue that it's all science. It's all analysis. It's all breaking things into its parts, constituent parts, but never putting it back together in the sense that, okay, now you've appreciated it. Now let's just listen to it and have this amazing experience. I would argue that even this direction that's being explored now of trying to explain our experience of music by going into neurophysiology and try to explain it as some sort of physical thing that, you know, neurons are firing a certain way when, you know, the sound waves hit our, I think it's completely misguided. But it speaks to the fact that our aesthetics are definitely suffering. And I want to say one more thing about that. Spengler, if you remember, said that a civilization that's in decline, one of its hallmarks is that its emphasis shifts from arts and creativity to technology and utilitarianism. And that is exactly what we're seeing.
All right, Phil, I completely agree with you, but I want to go a little bit further than that. I think you're being generous to these mental institutions. I don't think that they certainly, I agree with you that they don't have art, but I don't think they have science either. They are mental institutions in order to do something completely different. If you want to actually see what art is done, you look at the apprenticeship systems, the studios during the Renaissance. That's how you learn art, that's how you learn science. You can look at conservatories of music, where you learn both art and science together. And there they can actually do things. There is no such thing as science that can't produce, can't result in it. Like it is scientism, which is kind of pretending to be science without actually capturing the causal elements that are going to produce the experience. So it's not a question of art versus science. It is a question of, do you have something or nothing? So this is mostly nothing. And so that's what I would say. So I'm being very honest. It's like, because the thing is, art means a lot to me. And there is a lot of things which actually what it produces, they have to just write a whole bunch of things to say that it's art. And that's not it. The art has to actually speak to you. That is the standard. It has to really produce what Owen Barfield calls the felt transformation of consciousness. And it has to do it by itself. And you do all the science so that it is built into it. I mean, the best example is Leonardo. People would complain to him. It's like, okay, I have commissioned you to do the painting, but here you are mixing pigments for 3 months of trying to figure out what's going on. Secretly he is, cutting up corpses in order to figure out how exactly it is being, how exactly is human body put together. That is science and that is art. And then the art that it produces is something which is magical, something that really, produces, like you look at Mona Lisa or look at some of the paintings, you have this thing of, the common thing is that of mystery. So you are not able to actually see what your consciousness is doing. It is doing a lot, and you don't know how it is actually working, but it is doing that. And now that is real science of art, and that is real art produced by science. That is the standard that I'm thinking as a base. All right, let's see. Next up is Joe.
I just have a really quick question, and I think you actually kind of touched upon it in the beginning. How does post-structuralism impact history? Like how we account for history?
Yeah, so that's I hope that I made some reference to that, but let me just underscore.
You did in the beginning. You did in the beginning. Yeah.
So let me just underscore it again. So again, if you take meaning to be a fixed phenomena in general, in language even, and moreover, you take the second order systems built on top of it, the metaphors and additional semantics associated with myths, which essentially form into culture and how we view the world. If you consider that to be pretty much static, then your interpretation of history is going to stay the same. And so you could potentially write the ultimate history from that standpoint. However, what we see is, because it's actually not static and the meanings change, and the foci change of our, foci of our inquiry and emphasis constantly shifts. We invent new questions and new, we ask new questions of history, of the past, and therefore we focus on new facts that were never really part of the store of facts, right? We talked about how historical fact only becomes fact when you actually interrogate it, right? Before that, it's just something that is potentially discoverable, but never really brought to light. And so, like, I'll give you, I mean, there's like obvious examples. Today in history, the types of questions that are asked very often are the history of minorities, the history of slaves, the history of native peoples versus the colonizers. Those are not the histories that we read when I went to high school. The history that I read was from the standpoint of the discoverers, the heroes from Europe that went over to the New World and did all these exploits and fought the Indians and so on. So it's a completely different feel, and you end up with a completely different set of facts, and therefore your view of reality or your view of what happened, it changes completely when you look at it from a completely different standpoint. And a lot of times, here's what I was trying to convey last time when we talked about history. It's not just another perspective. Sometimes these perspectives are irreconcilable. They're both right, and they're both irreconcilable. And that's the world we have to live in. It's a world of, I mean, if you subscribe to this, now not everybody subscribes to this, but if you subscribe to it, you end up with this world that's like a coat that's composed of these patches, and it's a multi-patch coat that has multiple, depending on which patch you pick up, you get a different color, you get a different feel for it. And at the seams, this is where the battles are fought, right? Where you have these different standpoints that are really irreconcilable. I mean, think of a history of any colonial nation versus the colonized. I mean, you just cannot reconcile the two histories if you are looking at it from a perspective of, we brought the civilizing influence, the white man's burden, and so on, versus we were living the way we wanted to live, and here come these Europeans bringing their diseases and tell us how to modernize us, right? So something has to be, you end up with these two histories. And so post-structuralism is kind of the same idea, where you're saying, okay, the meaning is not fixed. It's being pulled constantly by the forces outside the system. Just like in history, you have these outside influences that are not really part of the historical facts at all. The historical facts are determined by these forces that are unseen, but are constantly shifting the public interest and public perception, and I would say public consciousness. And depending on that, you have different histories, different texts, and different meanings.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. All right, folks, we are almost running out of time. So Phil, what's coming up next 1 month from now?
Well, I was thinking that, we're basically at the forefront of the final chapter in this, which is, where do you go from post-structuralism? Well, it's deconstruction, right? So now that we've discovered that there's a possibility of multiple meanings and multiple interpretations, and the meaning is not fixed in this lattice, right, if you will, in this crystallized lattice of fixed relationships, the obvious next step is Jacques Derrida and deconstruction. So I think next time we'll talk about him.
Sure. All right. Phil, do you mind if we take a few minutes to talk about the plays at this point? We have several people who are regulars here for the plays. So folks, the idea is that we're going to take trilogies, okay? Not trilogies in the common sense, but we're going to take 3 plays at a time. Something that is common to all of them. I think Alison has suggested, 3 plays from Greek, maybe 3 plays by Shakespeare, and try to kind of come up with these combinations, which would be interesting combinations. So there is a like Shakespeare is Shakespeare, but he does very different kinds of plays. So you take, you can take Hamlet, and you can take something much, much lighter, and then something else. So you can think of, combinations. Similarly for Greek plays, we can do something from all the three great, Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides, something like that. Or maybe just take one of them and do like one cycle of three plays. You can look at a time, you can look at a theme that is common. So if you have any suggestions, let's have a conversation, because what we want to do is that we want to create a very robust community of people, because the magic of this discussions is based on the critical mass. Larger the group of people, it's amazing group of people that we have here, and always the larger the group of people, the more we will get from it. And we want to get you invested in the beginning itself by putting forth whatever it is that you would like to see. So any ideas, off the top of your head that you can think of, just let's talk about it for a few minutes. Phil, about 10 minutes, okay?
Yeah, sure.
Very good. So Alison, could you talk about a couple of trilogies that you suggested?
Yeah, I mean, I had, what did I put down? I put, for the Greek ones, Oedipus, the Persians, and then, what was the third?
Medea.
Oh, yeah, Medea, yeah. They're just plays I'd like to read that I'd just be interested in reading. I mean, Oedipus I read years ago, but the other two I hadn't. I read something by Aeschylus, so I'd like to read something else. And then with Shakespeare, I had said Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, but if you wanted a lighter one, what is the one? Not the donkey. I taught it. Oh, Midsummer Night's Dream. Yeah. So you'd have kind of a range with him. And then I threw in some, somewhat modern ones, Fences by August Wilson, and then Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. And then I don't know, I could pick another more modern one to go with it.
Sure. I mean, what we've typically found is that kind of more classic ones, more people recognize and more people will be able to get. So we'll try to get more kind of classic ones that people recognize, because we want to get large, group of people. Anybody else? DLJ, you had muted and unmuted. I don't know whether you wanted to say something.
No, it's just Alison was struggling for the donkey one. So I was going to say Midsummer Night's Dream.
Okay.
The donkey one in my head will always be there. Yeah.
I had this kid who she loved that in school she could scream out ass, and it was allowed because it was in Shakespeare. And the funny thing is, she grew up, became a teacher, and now teaches at my school. And so she and I still giggle about that.
Joe, what would you like to see?
I actually had, when I was thinking about it, two of the plays that Alison had talked about. I mean, Oedipus Rex was definitely one, and the other one was it Medea? Did you mention? Yeah, and then The Tempest, and then possibly King Lear.
Sure. I mean, we can do a repeat of Shakespeare. We'll take three at a time, and then we'll go to the next three or something. And we can figure out a way of kind of putting these three plays that work well together. So excellent. All right. Anything else anybody wants to add? Phil, do you have any ideas?
Well, I really wanted to suggest doing something by Lope de Vega.
Okay. Three plays, or
yeah, I mean, he wrote. He is a prolific writer. He wrote hundreds of plays, and I think there's some more famous than others, of course. But there were quite a few by him that I think I suggested originally. Shakespeare, of course, is great. We can do what was suggested already, plus maybe King Lear is a great one. Yeah, I think most everybody read Macbeth in school, so probably that one we can safely not discard, but maybe in favor of something else.
Sure. All right, folks, thank you very much. We're going to do retrospective meetup on all the plays that we have done. So please come for that. Even if you have not attended the plays, come to see what range of plays we can, what you can get from great plays. All right, that's going to be not this Sunday, the Sunday after this one. All right, Phil, thank you so much, and thank you everybody. It's wonderful. Bye everybody.
Good night.